Hey guys, so I am here today to do another supplementals episode, finally getting caught up on this huge backlog I had over break because I'm me and I'm a nerd. And I really didn't know what to title this one, and I mean, even right now I'm still considering this thumbnail and what I want to say, because I have two books on the Revolutionary War because I went through another Revolutionary War era binge. Then I have two very present books about two Democratic lawmakers during the Trump era. Both the lead impeachment managers have written books in the wake of the insurrection, and I'll talk about why I decided to read those when I get there. And then randomly, I have a third book by Colin Woodard, who is a person who featured twice in my last supplemental episode, and another book that he has written. So instead of starting, I normally kind of do these in chronological order, but why don't I start actually with the Colin Woodard, just to kind of get that out of the way, and then we can do these two weird pairs that I made the decision to read and I'll tell you about. But so the third Colin Woodard book that I have read is called American Character, A History of the Epic Struggle Between Individual Liberty and the Common Good. From that title, you can maybe guess why I decided to read it. I feel like there have been a lot of debates about this, especially with the coronavirus pandemic, and these ideas about individualism or collectivism are oftentimes what makes that decision for people. And then, of course, we have very strong strains at this point in our country, both of collective socialist ideas and things that lean that way, and then of course our very intense and historical libertarian individualistic pull yourself up by your own bootstraps ideology. And so I really thought that this book might be an interesting look at how sometimes America can hold both of those things at the same time, somehow without cognitive dissonance, and sometimes we veer, one way or the other really strongly. So the thing about this book is that it was published in 2016, prior to even Trump's election. So at one point, Colin Woodard says, and now as we go towards what is potentially a very contentious election, and you're like, you have no idea the shenanigans that are about to just be like the vitriol being, between party, inter-party. Oh, Colin. And I really wish that this had been written. Like, I want another edition of this now that we have gone through coronavirus and potentially the historical reactions to how people reacted to mandates. Like, and if Colin Woodard can map that onto his idea of these American nations. If you missed that last one, Colin Woodard's idea, his most famous book, is called American Nations, and he postulates that we are not North v. South, East v. West. There's actually 11 different regions on the continent of America, North America, veering into Central America, that make up our historical regional differences, and that's something we should attend to more rather than these fake binaries about, like I said, North v. South, East v. West, whatever. It's not the book's fault that it didn't really have the discussion that I wanted, but like I said, it did give me this really interesting look at how a map of reaction to coronavirus and reaction to the 2016 and 2020 elections might map into this book. And of course, it's all mostly, just Colin Woodard speculation. But one thing that did strike me in this one is that when he gets into, and again, this always happens with Colin Woodard books, they either have a really strong beginning and a lackluster ending, or a really lackluster beginning with a strong ending. Like, all three of them have had this problem. And with this one, it was a fairly strong beginning into this ending where Colin Woodard gives his kind of best practices. Like, he spends the entire book saying America will never be fully collective socialist, and it will never be purely individualist libertarian. There are too many people who believe too many variations on these themes, and so we have to find a middle way. And he goes then about explaining how his middle way would work in relation to each of these 11 regions, which, lean a little bit more collectivist or individualist, sort of. Again, you'd have to read the book to fully understand this argument, but weird things I think happen in this argument. So for example, he paints the Deep South as very dependent on its, plantation slavery history, which is true, but he talks about it like white people are the only people still voting down there, which, given, voter suppression laws, technically is kind of true. But I think we've seen, for example, in Georgia, when that went blue, that these single labels that Colin Woodard has given some of these regions do not actually reflect the diversity of them. They reflect the problems with voter suppression laws in those areas, or people within those areas that just don't vote for whatever reason. I don't know. I just thought that his argument, it sounded great, but it just lacked nuance and complication. And he said that in American Nations. He goes, I'm going to call this region this and say they're this, but obviously there are people there that don't believe that. When he came to postulating this theory in a more current sense, it just didn't really work for me. So read it yourself, read American Nations. American Character is built on American Nations, and then just see what you think for yourself. I think there's a lot of really interesting things to think about in these books, but I just don't know if I agree there has to be a middle way, but I don't agree with the equation he takes to get there. So in terms of my revolution books that I decided to read, first I did The British Are Coming, The War in America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777 by Rick Atkinson. This is the first time I think I've ever picked up a book because it had won an audiobook award, and I listened to a lot of audiobooks, and I thought, oh, this isn't really gonna matter that much, right? Like, I don't even know this award's name. This book is such a good audiobook, and it's surprising because Rick Atkinson is starting a trilogy doing a deep dive into the Revolutionary War, and particularly its military movements and the actions, and so it's really detail full, which in some audiobooks really doesn't work. But I was just so enthralled by this audiobook and his description of movements and of battles and of people. And I was like, oh my God, I can see why this won an audiobook award. It was just, and I'm not really interested in things like troop movements or battle tactics. Like, that's not my thing. That's not what I'm interested in these books necessarily. But it was just so listenable. So if that kind of deep dive into the military movements of the war are your thing, you should absolutely read this if you can listen to it. But even if it isn't, even if you're interested, I still highly recommend it. I'm mad that we're gonna have to wait a while the second book in this trilogy is not even out, so let alone the third. And I'm just like, now please? Now? Like, it's, there are no spoilers. I know what happens, but it's just the way that it's written. It's just really, really good. And it's hard to talk about a book that is that good, but it was a great listening experience. Honestly, it makes me feel bad when I talk about the other Revolutionary War book that I read at about the same time, and that was The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783 by Joseph Ellis. So here's the thing. The American Revolution and Its Discontents, so The Cause, versus The British Are Coming, versus the other Revolutionary War books that I mentioned in my last video, The Cause could very well be a really good book. But having read it on the heels of our first Civil War, by H.W. Brands, which I talked about in my last one, which I don't think was a very good book, but really did lean very heavily on first-person sources, which was really interesting. And then having The British Are Coming, which was very, very rich and detailed and took time with events. Also then reading The Cause. The Cause ended up feeling very surface level. So potentially that's a good thing for you. Maybe you want something that gives a very readable overview of the entire American Revolution, really focusing on why it happens and who the instigators are, and then like the issues and the problems that happen during it in a way that sometimes isn't present in a book that just focuses on, for example, the battle movements. But I kept coming up to parts where it'd be like, and then George Washington had a problem here, and it wouldn't spend very much time with it, and then it would keep going because this is a 1-volume overview essentially. And I'd go, yeah, I just was listening about this in The British Are Coming, and they gave it like 10 pages or whatever, and I feel like I understood it a lot more. So I feel maybe like I did Joseph Ellis a disservice by reading all of these books at the same time. The Cause is a great book. It's a great overview, but as someone who was enjoying the richness of the British Are Coming, it just felt very pale in comparison, so sorry. So finally, I read 2 brand new releases. The first being Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could by Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff is a representative from California. He was the first impeachment manager, the impeachment manager in Trump's first impeachment. God, that's so whatever. And I've talked in the past about not really being interested in reading books about current politicians, and I do mean that. Here's what happened. It was popular at my library, and it just kept going through circulation. And I was like, it's that thing where like you see it so many times, you feel like you will need to read it. And so I picked it up because I thought, well, you know, I talked about this when I reviewed Trump on Trial. I didn't pay as much attention to the first Trump impeachment. I don't really know anything about Adam Schiff. I thought, hey, what the heck, right? Because, of course, this is now taking the first impeachment through the second impeachment and then to the insurrection, essentially. So this is a very long view of that. And then understanding that Adam Schiff is a current politician, and there's probably going to be something in here. It's like very partisan, you know, whatever. But what was really, really interesting in this book is that Adam Schiff doesn't take, I'm not going to say he doesn't take issue with Trump, because obviously, but Adam Schiff takes more time and issue and space with representatives, other representatives in the House who have worked with him for a really long time because he's been there for decades, and who are Republicans, who were, if not his friends, at least genial work colleagues, who are people who did things together with him, and even some relationships that he had with some longtime senators, even though he didn't see them necessarily on a day-to-day basis, and really chronicling the shift in the Republican Party that he witnessed. Now again, he's a Democrat, it's whatever, you can take that with what you want to say, but I think with Adam Schiff taking that track, as opposed to just being like, Trump, which is definitely how some of these have, I'm sure, gone, I don't want to read those. It's a much more interesting discussion, and it's a much more institutional discussion, and it's a much more nuanced discussion about the shift that he has observed just in his time in the House, and some House members and other people who he has great respect for, who he genuinely just went, what? Like, where did all of your principles go when Trump got elected? So again, you have to take it all with a grain of salt. I definitely did. But I have to say that even like his description of the first impeachment, which was interesting from his side of the coin, second one, the insurrection, all very interesting, but it was just his deep commitment to not saying, you know, it's all Trump's problem, it's all Trump's fault, it begins and ends with Trump. He was like, this is a deeper institutional issue in Washington. So it made it more interesting to read. And so I read it. So after reading Midnight in Washington and that not being what I expected, I then went and read Unthinkable Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Justice by Jamie Raskin. So Jamie Raskin was the lead impeachment manager of Trump's second impeachment, and this is the one that I watched all the way through. And so I spent a lot of time watching Jamie Raskin talk during the trial and learning about his personal tragedy prior to the insurrection. So there's going to be a bit of talk about suicide here. If that is not for you, skip until I put this book down. So on December 31st, Jamie Raskin's son, Tommy, committed suicide after a very long and turbulent battle with depression. And Jamie Raskin's first day back at work was January 6th when they went to count and approve the Electoral College votes. His daughter and one of his sons-in-laws, he has two other children, both daughters, came with him to the Capitol today because they didn't want him to be alone. And for a good chunk of the insurrection, he had no idea where they were, if they were safe, and it turns out they were hiding under a desk in one of the leadership's offices. So what was already an incredibly traumatic time for Jamie Raskin became even worse. And then he was asked to lead the second impeachment, which he says was like a lifeline thrown to him when he was just not even sure if he was going to go on with his life, essentially. Jamie Raskin is a known progressive liberal. I would say more progressive, more liberal than Adam Schiff. The language in here is much more partisan. When he is talking about politics, he feels much more strongly anti-Trump, anti-Republican Party. But honestly, that is not why this book, like I love this book so much that I bought it in physical. This is my physical copy. Tommy Raskin, Jamie Raskin's son, this is an elegy for him, for his son, and the good that his son believed could exist in the world, despite his depression, despite everything that he was battling. You know, Tommy and Jamie were so close, and there are just moments where I was just crying reading this book. Not because it was political, not because it was a description of the insurrection, but because it was just a discussion of Tommy and Jamie having a conversation about the state of the world and humanity and the choices that we make. And of course, I'm listening to the audiobook and Jamie Raskin narrates it, and there are just clear points where he is crying. And I'm pretty sure they had to, cut so he could like stop crying and continue reading, which again makes the audiobook very powerful. The point of this book, even if, he's more progressive or liberal than you are, is that January 6th for him could have been the end. His optimism, his belief in the value of life, like his son was gone. He felt like America had just imploded, his life personally, his life publicly, he just felt like it had all just shattered into dust. All his dreams, all his optimism, all his belief. And weirdly enough, through meeting and talking to people during the trial, and also coming to find that his son was really a guidepost for him on this entire journey. It brought him back to a place where he truly did recommit to the beauty of America and the beauty of Americans as a whole people. And it's just gorgeous. Not, again, because of the politics, although, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's come out by now that I'm a fairly liberal Democrat, but just because it is someone who, and I think, you know, we've all gotten to that point over, you know, the last 10 years, really, if you want to count, you know, December, if you go back to Wildlands Point by Evan Osnos, and, you know, September 11th, 2001 was great unity moment, and then we've just fractured since then. It's just a wonderful story about someone from literally the lowest point you could possibly be, just coming back to believe in this country and people and life and hope and dreams. And it made me cry. So again, don't read this book, no matter your politics, if you do not want to have copious discussions about suicide and mental health, and descriptions of not, you know, the body, but the day that Tommy died, the aftermath for the family. Like, I mean, Jamie Raskin leaves no stone unturned there to really just, you know, make his point, essentially. And to, like I said, this book is a love letter to his son and the America that his son believed in, and that the America that when Jamie lost all his belief and hope, you know, he came to find again through his son. So it's a lot of feelings. But again, I bought it, and I actually, yesterday, as of filming this, Jamie Raskin did an event with a bookstore on Zoom, and I attended, just cause it was kind of cool. He was actually voting on the Ukraine bill. So at one point he was like, I gotta go, in his office in the Capitol, and he was like, yeah, I gotta go vote. And then the moderator stopped while he went and voted. So, that was funny. But, yeah, that is 5 more books from me. I hope that you guys enjoy. This has been, once again, longer than I meant it to be. There's really interesting books in here, so who knows what's gonna come next. I am catching up on my backlog and just doing a lot of school stuff, so I'm gonna probably not make another one of these for a while. But thanks for hanging out, guys. If you have recommendations for me, audiobook recommendations especially, let me know down below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!